is, for him, this idea of a particular sense, a distinguishing aspect of awareness. And I think philosophically that is quite an interesting and bold idea. That in general the implication is emotions are a form of cognition. Now, the first of the moves he makes in unfolding his account of bhakti is to say, is to establish that unlike Shankara's radical revisionary metaphysics, in which what we have in ordinary experience is fundamentally different from what is the Vedantic truth, Ramanuja is, as people have pointed out, a realist. That is to say, he does not want to deny the epistemic value of ordinary experience. What he does want to challenge is its what might be seen as a soteriological value, that is to say, the value in relationship to the ultimate attainment. So in order to show that, he must say that it is not as if the way in which human beings operate ordinarily in the world is somehow different from what happens to their consciousness in non-duality, which is Shankara's claim. So Ramanuja makes that point, this point about realism, through saying that, in fact, how we feel our emotions, how we undergo the experience of love, is no different in ordinary life than it is in bhakti. What is different is not, therefore, the content of our conscious states, but the vishaya, the object, the contentful object towards which our intentionality is directed. Within that framework, therefore, he realizes that the obvious challenge is to say, now, normally we use the idea of love, priti, as something which is antagonistic to the spiritual life. To love the things of the world is to turn away from devotion to God, is it not? So why are you, he asks himself the question through the Purva-paksha, the question of, is it not the case that love is commonly related to a worthless happiness? And the happiness that is to be won by this distinguishing awareness is something else altogether. So if you're going to say that the happiness that is attained through bhakti is, of course, ultimate, why are you bringing in the notion of priti here? Is that not something that is just associated with worthless happiness? So he has to explain that the problem is not one about the nature of our love, but the object of our love. So his explanation is, cognitions with objectual content, which is my rather clunky term for elaborate philosophical reasons I don't have the time to go into now, is vishaya, come under the category of happiness, sadness, and what is intermediate. And sadness is just my translation here for dukkha. They become particular according to that content. If a cognition is particularized by, if its identity is determined by a particular content that generates happiness, it is accordingly held dear. The cognition that has that objectual content is itself happiness, for we observe no other corresponding thing. This is because what occurs in just the practical behavior of being happy. So this is his move here. When there is an emotional content to your awareness, he says, it isn't as if there are two different things here. It isn't as if there is a cognitive state and there is an emotional state. You don't actually find something left over. To be aware that one is happy is to be happy, to have a relationship of happiness with, in the ordinary world, somebody else or some possession, is simply to be happy. So he wants to make this general point that, and I think that is actually an insufficiently investigated aspect of in Indian philosophy, that the happiness and the cognition are not two different things. If you have that general principle, that there are two sides to our states of awareness, one is the cognitive, the other is the happiness, the emotion that is generated in it, then the only difference, and this is where Ramanuja's realism comes in, the only difference to do with the worthless happiness, the love of other human beings, the love of objects in the world, and the love that is devotion, has to do with the objectual content of our attention. So the particularization of a cognition as intrinsically happy in the case of anything other than Brahman is inferior and unfixed. But with Brahman itself, it is preeminent and fixed. Why? Well, because Brahman is, as it were, all possibilities of happiness are contained in Brahman, because there is in fact a strict identity, as we know, between Brahman and bliss from the Upanishads. So, for him, what varies and what makes the ordinary emotions of our life unworthy, unfixed, worthless, is to do with the objects. Those objects are transient, therefore the nature of the emotion generated in it, in cognition of it, is worthless. What does not change, in fact, is the category of happiness that is both a cognition and an emotion. What does differ is the nature of the object, and since Brahman is intrinsically happiness, is identical with happiness, so too our cognition is fixed in a way that it is not with objects. And I think that is very important in, exactly as Professor Padmanabhan was saying, we understand Advaita and Vishishta Advaita very much in terms of what the other is saying. And we really need to keep the radical claims of Shankara in mind to appreciate what Ramanuja is doing here. So I'm not, as I said, going to be able to cover too much of the details of his argument here, leave it for the paper that results from it, and I certainly want to leave enough time for you to be able to have a discussion with me about it and learn from your perspectives. So I will go through the subsequent sections a little bit more quickly. So here he carries on with perhaps the second move that we have here, and that of course is famous, is well established, is nothing new to claim here. Anybody who reads Ramanuja knows that in his mapping, there is no difference, of course, between the Paramatman and the Paramapurusha. And that requires a separate kind of justification on his part, that when he is talking about the essence that is Brahman, and you can see that transition happening here from when he says that the meaning of this is that Brahman alone is happiness, and getting Brahman one becomes happy. This is a continuation of the previous part. Then he makes the transition, the Supreme Person, being by himself on his own boundless and preeminent happiness, becomes a happiness of another too. That is to say, all that is said of Brahman in the strict Vedantic sense, which does not in fact refer to the Paramapurusha, that is Sriman Narayana, is in fact the same. So he has to make, of course, a different point, which he has already argued for before, and which is in fact a central challenge in our interpretation of Vishittadvaita as both Sri Vaishnava and Vedanta. What is said about Brahman in this way is also said about the Paramapurusha. Ramanuja has a much more complex account of this in the Gita Bhashya than he has here about what the different categories of Brahman are. But at any rate, there is one understanding of Brahman and there's one understanding of the Supreme Person, and that is that they are identical. So what is said about happiness in the strictly Vedantic context of the relationship between the consciousness of the individual self and its relationship to the intrinsic nature of Brahman is simultaneously what can be said about the individual Bhakta and the Paramapurusha. If you're not convinced of that move, and there are people who are not, then Ramanuja's system comes under stress. That's not the purpose of my talk here, so I'm not going to push on that further. So he carries on talking about how the realization of the nature of Brahman is intrinsic to the recognition of what is the kind of happiness that is worthy and fixed, as opposed to what is worthless and unfixed. Now, having set up this sequence that there is a continuity between the nature of our emotional states in regard to worldly objects and our emotional states in relationship to Brahman, he goes on then to say that the only difference is that the intrinsic nature of Brahman, which is also the intrinsic nature of the Paramapurusha, is so fundamentally different from the objects of the world that while our emotional state is the same, it becomes worthy and fixed by virtue of the intrinsic nature of the object in the latter instance. But what is the nature, what is the implication of that? He imagines the objection, which he summarizes in this way, which is, now we can understand why in the ordinary world we have a life of love and life of sadness. We have an emotional life, because it is our decision, our agency, which places us in a relationship with these objects, with the people and the things we love. That is why that is there. It gives us the sense of freedom. But how can you gain happiness when in the relationship with the Paramapurusha, it is only possible through sacrificing that independence? So he imagines a very skeptical response, to which, of course, his core answer, and an answer that he is remarkably consistent about across his works, is to say that that sense of independence, of course, is generated by what I call the appropriative conceit that knits together the flesh and the self. So it is only because we have this abhimana, this pride, this idea that we occupy our bodies, that the worthless, unfixed love that seems to result through our exercise of agency is possible. So once this is where Ramanuja's dualism, realism become very, very important, because for him there should be no explaining away of the nature of bodiliness that Shankara does. And again, Shankara is very much at the background of this, or the pre-Ramanuja Advaitic thought. For Ramanuja, it is important that there is a real relationship between a self and a body, because it is through that anchoring in the body that the experience of life as an act of agency by which we have emotional relationships with objects is possible. But of course, once we follow him that far, we understand, of course, that that is his account of how the ahamiti, the I-ness, is generated. And once more, the force of his account of the I is to be appreciated only by keeping in mind how Shankara's account of the I is very different. And again, something that needs more attention than I can give here. So Ramanuja gives a very humane account of our relationship with objects of the world. And this is something we should really keep in mind. While he wants, of course, to say that our emotional life in this world and our relationship with others and objects is ultimately worthless, is unfixed, unmoored, and that truly and absolutely the only such relationship is with a God who is Brahman, he does not want to deny the importance and the textured nature of our ordinary life. So Ramanuja is both critical of the need to move away from ordinary life into the life of devotion, and at the same time very understanding of how this ordinary life happens. And so for him, yes, of course, we have this abhimana, what we take ourselves to be, but we must also understand that this is not some irrational, unmotivated act on our part. And part of the criticism here is that Shankara does not give an adequate account of human psychology.